others. I have.
But at the third time of trying, a hatch in the door opened briefly, then closed. The door swung open almost immediately thereafter, and a suspicious armed servant admitted him. He blurted out his business, and was conducted to a first-floor room where Alberti sat at a desk covered with papers. Beyond him, half turned away and sitting in a chair by a dying fire, Ezio thought he could see another man, tall and powerful, but only part of his profile was visible, and that indistinctly. "Ezio?" Alberti stood up, surprised. "What are you doing here at this hour?" I don't..." Alberti approached him and put a hand on his shoulder. "Wait, child. Take a breath. Collect your thoughts." Ezio nodded. Now he felt safer. He also felt more vulnerable. The events of the evening and night since he had set out to deliver Giovanni's letters were catching up with him. From the brass pedestal clock on the desk, he could see that it was close to midnight. Could it really only be 12 hours since Ezio, the boy, had gone with his mother to collect paintings from an artist's studio? Despite himself, he felt close to tears, but he collected himself, and it was Ezio the man who spoke. "My father and brothers have been imprisoned. I do not know on whose authority. My mother and sister are in hiding, and our family seat is ransacked. My father enjoined me to deliver this letter and these papers to you." Ezio drew the documents from his pouch. "Thank you." Alberti put on a pair of eyeglasses and took Giovanni's letter to the light of the candle burning on his desk. There was no sound in the room apart from the ticking of the clock and the occasional soft crash as the embers of the fire collapsed on themselves. If there was another presence in the room, Ezio had forgotten it. Alberti now turned his attention to the documents. He took some time over them, and finally placed one of them discreetly inside his black doublet. The others he put carefully to one side, apart from the other papers on his desk. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding, my dear Ezio," he said, taking off his spectacles. "It's true that allegations were laid, serious allegations, and that a trial has been scheduled for tomorrow morning. But it seems that someone may have been, perhaps for reasons of their own, overly zealous. But don't worry, I'll clear everything up." Ezio hardly dared to believe him. "How?" "The documents you've just given me contain evidence of a conspiracy against your father and against the city. I'll present these papers at the hearing in the morning, and Giovanni and your brothers will be released. I guarantee it." Relief flooded through the young man. He clasped the Gonfalonier's hand. "How can I thank you?" "The administration of justice is my job, Ezio. I take it very seriously, and..." For a fraction of a second he hesitated. "Your father is one of my dearest friends." Alberti smiled. "But where are my manners?" "I haven't even offered you a glass of wine." He paused. "And where will you spend the night? I still have some urgent business to attend to, but my servants will see that you have food and drink and a warm bed." At the time, Ezio didn't know why he refused so kind an offer. It was well after midnight by the time he left the Gonfalonier's mansion. Pulling up his hood again, he prowled through the streets, trying to arrange his thoughts. Presently, he knew where his feet were taking him. Once there, he climbed to the balcony with greater ease than he'd imagined possible. Perhaps urgency lent strength to his muscles, and knocked gently on her shutters, calling quietly, "Cristina, amore, wake up, it's me." He waited, silent as a cat, and listened. He could hear her stirring, rising, and then her voice, scared, on the other side of the shutters. "Who is it?" "Ezio." She opened the shutters swiftly. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Let me come in, please." Sitting on her bed, he told her the whole story. "I knew something was amiss," she said. "My father seemed troubled this evening, but it does sound as if all will be well." I need you to let me stay here tonight. Don't worry. I'll be gone long before dawn. And I need to leave something with you for safekeeping." He unslung his pouch and placed it between them. "I must trust you." "Oh, Ezio, of course you can." He fell into a troubled sleep in her arms. 4. It was a grey and overcast morning, and the city felt oppressed with the muggy heat that was trapped by the overhanging cloud. Ezio arrived at the Piazza della Signoria and saw, to his intense surprise, that a dense crowd had gathered already. A platform had been erected, and on it was placed a table covered with a heavy brocade cloth bearing the arms of the city. Standing behind it were Uberto Alberti and a tall, powerfully built man with a beaky nose and careful, calculating eyes, dressed in robes of rich crimson, a stranger to Ezio at least. But his attention was caught by the sight of the 4. It was a grey and overcast morning, and the city felt oppressed with the muggy heat that was trapped by the overhanging cloud. Ezio arrived at the Piazza della Signoria and saw, to his intense surprise, that a dense crowd had gathered already. A platform had been erected, and on it was placed a table covered with a heavy brocade cloth bearing the arms of the city. Standing behind it were Uberto Alberti and a tall, powerfully built man with a beaky nose and careful, calculating eyes, dressed in robes of rich crimson, a stranger to Ezio at least. But his attention was caught by the sight of the other occupants of the platform, his father and his brothers, all in chains. And just beyond them stood a tall construction with a heavy crossbeam from which 3 nooses were suspended. Ezio had arrived at the piazza in a mood of anxious optimism. Had not the Gonfaloniere told him that all would be resolved this day? Now his feelings changed. Something was wrong, badly wrong. He tried to push his way forward, but could not press through the mob. He felt the claustrophobia threaten to overwhelm him. Desperately trying to calm down, to rationalize his actions, he paused, drew his hood close over his head, and adjusted the sword at his belt. Surely Alberti would not let him down. And all the time he noticed that the tall man, a Spaniard by his dress, his face, and his complexion, was ranging the mass of people with those piercing eyes. Who was he? Why did he stir something in Ezio's memory? Had he seen him somewhere before? The Gonfaloniere, resplendent in his robes of office, raised his arms to quieten the people, and instantly a hush fell over them. "Giovanni Auditore," said Alberti, in a commanding tone which failed, to Ezio's acute ear, to conceal a note of fear. "You and your accomplices stand accused of the crime of treason. Have you any evidence to counter this charge?" Giovanni looked at once surprised and uneasy. "Yes, you have it all in the documents that were delivered last night." But Alberti said, "I know of no such documents, Auditore." Ezio saw at once that this was a show trial, but he couldn't understand what looked like deep treachery on Alberti's part. He shouted, "It's a lie!" but his voice was drowned by the roar of the crowd. He struggled to get closer, shoving angry citizens aside, but there were too many of them, and he was trapped in their midst. Alberti was speaking again. "The evidence against you has been amassed and examined. It is irrefutable. In the absence of any proof to the contrary, I am bound by my office to pronounce you and your accomplices, Federico and Petruccio, and, in absentia your son Ezio, guilty of the crimes you stand accused of." He paused as the crowd once more fell silent. "I hereby sentence you all to death, the sentence to be carried out immediately." The crowd roared again. At a signal from Alberti, The hangman prepared the nooses, while two of his assistants took first little Petruchio, who was fighting back tears, to the gallows. The rope was placed round his neck as he prayed rapidly, and the attendant priest shook holy water onto his head. Then the executioner pulled a lever set into the scaffold, and the boy dangled, kicking the air until he was still. "No!" mouthed Ezio, barely able to believe what he was seeing. "No! God, please, no!" But his words were choked in his throat, his loss overcoming all. Federico was next, bellowing his innocence and that of his family, struggling in vain to break loose from the guards who wrestled him towards the gallows. Ezio, now beside himself, striving desperately forward again, saw a solitary tear roll down his father's ashen cheek. Aghast, Ezio watched as his older brother and greatest friend jolted at the rope's end. It took longer for him to leave the world than it had taken Petruchio, but at last he, too, was still, swaying from the gallows. You could hear the wooden crossbeam creak in the silence. Ezio fought with the disbelief within him. Could this really be happening? The crowd began to murmur, but then a firm voice stilled it. Giovanni Auditore was speaking. "It is you who are the traitor, Uberto. You, one of my closest associates and friends, in whom I entrusted my life. I am a fool. I did not see that you are one of them." Here he raised his voice to a great cry of anguish and of rage. "You may take our lives this day, but mark this, we will have yours in return." He bowed his head and fell silent. A deep silence, interrupted only by the murmured prayers of the priest, followed as Giovanni Auditore walked with dignity to the gallows and commended his soul to the last great adventure it would travel on. Ezio was too shocked to feel grief at first. It was as if a great iron fist had slammed into him. But as the trap opened below Giovanni, he couldn't help himself. "Father!" he cried, his voice cracking. Instantly, the Spaniard's eyes were on him. Was there something supernatural about the man's vision to pick him out in such a throng? As if in slow motion, Ezio saw the Spaniard lean towards Alberti, whisper something, and point. "Guards!" shouted Alberti, pointing as well. "There! That's another one of them! Seize him!" Before the crowd could react and restrain him, Ezio muscled through it to its edge, smashing his fists into anyone who stood barring his way. A guard was already waiting for him. He snatched at Ezio, pulling back his hood. Acting now on some instinctive drive within him, Ezio wrenched free and drew his sword with one hand, grabbing the guard by the throat with the other. Ezio's reaction had been far faster than the guard had anticipated, and before he could bring his arms up to defend himself, Ezio tightened his grip on both throat and sword, and in one swift punching movement ran the guard through, slicing the sword in the body as it drew it out so that the man's intestines spilled from under his tunic onto the cobblestones. He threw the body aside and turned to the rostrum, fixing Alberti with his eye. "I will kill you for this!" he screamed, his voice straining with hatred and rage. But other guards were closing in. Ezio, his instinct for survival taking over, sped away from them, towards the comparative safety of the narrow streets beyond the square. To his dismay, he saw two more guards, swift of foot, rushing to cut him off. They confronted each other at the edge of the square. The two guards faced him, blocking his retreat, the others closing in behind. Ezio fought them both frantically. Then an unlucky parry from one of them knocked his sword out of his hand. Fearing that this was the end, Ezio turned to flee from his attackers, but before he could find his feet, something astonishing happened. From the narrow street he was making for, and was within a few feet of, a roughly dressed man appeared. With lightning speed, he came up to the two guards from behind, and with a long dagger cut deep under the pits of their sword arms, tearing through tendons and rendering them useless. He moved so fast that Ezio could scarcely follow his movements as he retrieved the young man's fallen sword and threw it to him. Ezio suddenly recognized him and smelled once more the stench of onions and garlic. At that moment, damask roses couldn't have smelled sweeter. "Get out of here," said the man, and then he too was gone. Ezio plunged down the street and ducked off it down alleys and lanes he knew intimately from his nightly forays with Federico. The hue and cry behind him faded. He made his way down to the river and found refuge in a disused watchman's shack behind one of the warehouses belonging to Christina's father. In that hour, Ezio ceased to be a boy and became a man. The weight of the responsibility he now felt he carried to avenge and correct this hideous wrong fell on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Slumping down on a pile of discarded sacks, he felt his whole body begin to shake. His world had just been torn apart. His father, Federico, and God, no, little Petruccio, all gone, all dead, all murdered. Holding his head in his hands, he broke down, unable to control the pouring out of sorrow, fear, and hatred. Only after several hours was he able to uncover his face, his eyes bloodshot and run through with an unbending vengeance. At that moment, Ezio knew his former life was over. Ezio the boy was gone forever. From now, his life was forged for one purpose, and one purpose alone: revenge. Much later in the day, knowing full well that the watch would still be out looking for him relentlessly, he made his way via back alleys to Christina's family mansion. He didn't want to put her in any danger, but he needed to collect his pouch with its precious contents. He waited in a dark alcove that stank of urine, not moving even when rats scuttled at his feet, until a light in her window told him that she had retired for the night. "Ezio!" she cried as she saw him on her balcony. "Thank God you're alive!" Her face flooded with relief, but that was short-lived, grief taking over. "Your father and brothers—" She couldn't finish the sentence, and her head bowed. Ezio took her in his arms, and for several minutes they just stood, holding each other. Finally, she broke away. "You're mad. What are you still doing in Florence?" "I still have matters to attend to," he said grimly. "But I cannot stay here long. It's too big a risk for your family. If they thought you were harboring me—" Christina was silent. "Give me my satchel, and I'll be gone." She fetched it for him, but before she gave it to him, said, "What about your family?" "That is my first duty, to bury my dead. I can't see them thrown into a lime pit like common criminals." "I know where they have taken them." "How?" "The town's been talking all day, but no one will be there now. They're down near the Porta San Nicolo, with the bodies of paupers. There's a pit prepared, and they're waiting for the lime carts to come in the morning. Oh, Ezio." Ezio spoke calmly but grimly. "I must see to it that my father and my brothers have a fitting departure from this earth. I cannot offer them a requiem mass, but I can spare their bodies in dignity." "I'll come with you." "No." "Do you realize what it would mean if you were caught with me?" Christina lowered her eyes. "I must see that my mother and sister are safe too, and I owe my family one more death." He hesitated. "Then I will leave, perhaps forever. The question is, will you come with me?" She drew back, and he could see a host of conflicting emotions in her eyes. Love was there, deep and lasting, but he had grown so much older than she since they had first held each other in their arms. She was still a girl. How could he expect her to make such a sacrifice? "I want to, Ezio. You don't know how much, but my family. It would kill my parents." Ezio looked at her gently. Though they were the same age, his recent experience had made him suddenly far more mature than she was. He had no family to depend on anymore, just responsibility and duty, and it was hard. I was wrong to ask, and who knows, perhaps some day, when all this is behind us." He put his hands to his neck, and from the folds of his collar withdrew a heavy silver pendant on a fine chain of gold. He took it off. The pendant bore a simple design, just the initial letter A of his family name. "I want you to have this. Take it, please." With trembling hands, she accepted it, crying softly. She looked down at it, then up at him, to thank him, to make some further excuse. But he was gone. On the south bank of the Arno, near the Porta San Nicolo, Ezio found the bleak place where the bodies were arranged next to a huge, gaping pit. 2 sorry-looking guards, raw recruits by the look of them, patrolled nearby, dragging their halberds as much as carrying them. The sight of their uniforms aroused Ezio's anger, and his first instinct was to kill them, but he had seen enough of death that day, and these were just country boys who'd stumbled into uniforms for want of anything better. It caught at his heart when he saw his father's and his brother's bodies lying near the edge of the pit, still with their nooses round their scorched necks. But he could see that once the guards fell asleep, as they surely would soon, he could carry the corpses to the river's edge, where he had prepared an open boat which he'd loaded with brushwood. It was about the 3rd hour, and the first faint light of dawn was already bleaching the eastern sky by the time he had completed his task. He stood alone on the riverbank, watching as the boat bearing his kinsmen's bodies, all aflame, drifted slowly with the current towards the sea. He watched until the light of the fire flickered away into the distance. He made his way back to the city. A hard resolve had overcome his grief. There was still much to do. But first, he must rest. He returned to the watchman's shack and made himself as comfortable as he could. Some little sleep would not be denied, but even as he slept, Christina would not leave his thoughts or dreams. He knew the approximate whereabouts of the house of Annetta's sister, though he had never been there, or indeed met Paola. But Annetta had been his wet nurse, and he knew that if he could trust no one else, he could trust her. He wondered if she knew, as she must, of the fate that had befallen his father and brothers, and if so, whether she had told his mother and sister. He approached the house with great care, using an indirect route, and covering the distance where he could by running at a crouch over rooftops in order to avoid the busy streets where, he was sure, Uberto Alberti would have his men searching. Ezio could not rid himself of the thought of Alberti's treachery. What faction had his father referred to on the gallows? What could induce Alberti to bring about the death of one of his closest allies? Paola's house lay in a street just north of the cathedral, Ezio knew. But when he got there, he didn't know which it was. There were few signs hanging from the fronts of the buildings here to identify them, and he could not afford to loiter in case he was recognized. He was about to depart when he saw Annetta herself coming from the direction of the Piazza San Lorenzo. Pulling his hood down so that his face was shadowed, he made his way to meet her, making himself walk at a normal pace, trying as best he could to blend in with his fellow citizens as they went about their business. He passed Annetta herself, and was gratified that she did not give any sign that she had noticed him. A few yards on, he doubled back and fell into step just behind her. Annetta. She had the wit not to turn round. Ezio, you're safe. I wouldn't say that. Are my mother and sister? They are protected. Oh, Ezio, your poor father, and Federico, and... She stifled a sob. Little Petruccio. I have just come from San Lorenzo. I lit a candle to San Antonio for them. They say the Duke will be here soon, perhaps... Do my mother and Maria know what has happened? We thought it best to keep that knowledge from them. Ezio thought for a moment. It is best so. I will tell them when the time is right. He paused. Will you take me to them? I couldn't identify your sister's house. I am on my way there now. Stay close and follow me. He fell back a little, but kept her in sight. The establishment she entered had the grim, fortress-like facade of so many of the grander Florentine buildings, but once inside, Ezio was taken aback. This was not quite what he had expected. He found himself in a richly decorated parlour of great size and high-ceilinged. It was dark, and the air was close. Velvet hangings in dark reds and deep browns covered the walls, interspersed with oriental tapestries depicting scenes of unequivocal luxury and sexual pleasure. The room was illuminated by candlelight, and a smell of incense hung in the air. The furniture mainly consisted of deep-seated daybeds, covered with cushions of the costly brocade, and low tables, on which there were trays bearing wine in silver carafes, Venetian glasses, and golden bowls of sweetmeats. But what was most surprising were the people in the room. A dozen beautiful girls, wearing silks and satins in green and yellow, cut in the Florentine fashion, but with skirts slit to the top of the thigh and plunging necklines that left nothing to the imagination except the promise of where it should not venture. Around 3 walls of the room, beneath the hangings and tapestries, a number of doors could be seen. Ezio looked round, in a sense not knowing where to look. "Are you sure this is the right place?" he asked Annetta. "Ma certo, and here is my sister to greet us." An elegant woman, who must have been in her late 30s, but looked 10 years younger, as beautiful as any principessa, and better dressed than most, was coming towards them from the centre of the room. There was a veiled sadness in her eyes that somehow increased the sexual charge she transmitted, and Ezio, for all else that was on his mind, found himself stirred. She extended her long-fingered, bejewelled hand to him. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Messer Auditore." She looked at him appraisingly. "Annetta speaks quite highly of you, and now I can see why." Ezio, blushing despite himself, replied, "I appreciate the kind words, Madonna. Please call me Paola." Ezio bowed. "I cannot sufficiently express my gratitude to you for extending your protection to my mother and sister, Paola. It was the least I could do. Are they here? May I see them?" "They are not here. This would be no place for them, and some of my clients are highly placed in the city's governance." "Is this place, then, forgive me, but is it what I think it is?" Paola laughed. "Of course. But I hope it is rather different from those stews down by the docks. It is really too early for business, but we like to be ready. There's always the chance of the occasional caller on his way to the office. Your timing is perfect." "Where is my mother? Where is Claudia?" "They are safe, Ezio, but it's too risky to take you to see them now, and we mustn't compromise their security." She drew him to a sofa and sat down with him. Annetta, meanwhile, disappeared into the bowels of the house on some business of her own. "I think it will be best," Paola continued, "for you to leave Florence with them at the earliest opportunity. But you must rest first. You must gather your strength, for you have a long and arduous road ahead of you. Perhaps you'd like—" "You are kind, Paola," he interrupted her gently, "and you are right in what you suggest. But just now I cannot stay." "Why? Where are you going?" During their conversation, Ezio had been growing even calmer as all his racing thoughts came crashing together. At last he found himself able to shrug off his shock and his fear, for he had come to a decision and found a purpose, both of which he knew were irrevocable. "I am going to kill Uberto Alberti," he said. Paola looked worried. "I understand your desire for vengeance, but the Gonfaloniere is a powerful man, and you're not a natural killer, Ezio." "Fate is making me one," he thought, but he said as politely as he could, "Spare me the lecture," for he was bent on his mission. Paola ignored him and completed her sentence. "But I can make you one." Ezio fought down suspicion. "And why would you want to teach me how to kill?" She shook her head. "In order to teach you how to survive." I'm not sure that I need any training from you." She smiled. "I know how you feel, but please, allow me to hone the skills I am sure you have naturally. Think of my teaching as an extra weapon in your armory." She started his training that very day, recruiting those girls who were off duty and trusted house servants to help her. In the high-walled garden behind the house, she organized 20 of her people into 5 groups of 4. They then started to mill around the garden, crisscrossing each other, talking and laughing, some of the girls casting bold looks on Ezio and smiling. Ezio, who still carried his precious pouch at his side, was immune to their charms. "Now," Paula told him, "discretion is paramount in my profession. We must be able to walk the streets freely, seen but unseen. You too must learn properly how to blend in like us and become one with the city's crowds." Ezio was about to protest, but she held up her hand. "I know. Annetta tells me you do not acquit yourself badly, but you have more to learn than you know. I want you to pick a group and try to blend in with them. I don't want to be able to pick you out. Remember what almost happened to you at the execution." These harsh words stung Ezio, but the task didn't appear to him that difficult, provided he used his discretion. Still, under her unforgiving eye, he found it harder than he'd expected. He would jostle clumsily against someone or trip up, sometimes causing the girls or the male servants in his selected group to scatter from him, leaving him exposed. The garden was a pleasant place, sunlit and lush, and birds chirruped in the ornamental trees, but in Ezio's mind it became a labyrinth of unfriendly city streets, a potential enemy in every passer-by. And always he was nettled by Paula's unremitting criticism. "Careful," she would say. "You can't go charging in like that. Show my girls some respect. Tread carefully when you're near them. How do you plan to blend in with people if you're busy knocking them around?" "Oh, Ezio, I expected better from you." But at last, on the 3rd day, the biting comments grew fewer, and on the morning of the 4th, he was able to pass right under Paula's nose without her batting an eyelid. Indeed, after 15 minutes without saying a word, Paula called out, "All right, Ezio, I give up. Where are you?" Pleased with himself, he emerged from a group of girls, himself the very model of one of the young male house servants. Paula smiled and clapped her hands, and the others joined in the applause. But the work didn't end there. "Now that you have learned to blend into a crowd," Paula told him on the morning of the following day, "I am going to show you how to use your newfound skill in order to steal." Ezio balked at this, but Paula explained, "It is an essential survival skill which you may need on your journey. A man is nothing without money, and you may not always be in a position to earn it honestly. I know you would never take anything from anyone who could not afford to lose it, or from a friend. Think of it as a blade in a penknife, which you seldom use, though it's good to know it's there." Learning how to pick pockets was a lot harder. He would sidle up to a girl successfully enough, but as soon as his hand closed on the purse at her girdle, she would scream "Al ladro!" and flee from him. When he first managed to draw some coins out successfully, he stayed where he was for a moment, triumphant, then felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Ti arresto," said the manservant, who was playing the role of a city watchman, grinning. But Paula did not smile. "Once you've stolen from someone, Ezio," she said, "you mustn't linger." He was learning faster now, though, and was beginning to appreciate the need to acquire the skills he was being taught, as necessary for the successful accomplishment of his mission. Once he had successfully fleeced 10 girls, the last 5 without even Paula noticing, she announced that the tutorial was at an end. "Back to work, girls," she said. "Playtime's over." "Do we have to?" the girls murmured reluctantly as they took their leave of Ezio. "He's so cute, so innocent." But Paula was adamant. She walked with him alone in the garden. As always, he kept one hand on his pouch. "Now that you've learned how to approach the enemy," she said, "we need to find you a suitable weapon, something far more subtle than a sword." "Well, but what would you have me use?" "Why, you already have the answer." And she produced the broken blade and bracer which Ezio had taken from his father's strong box, and which even now he believed to be safely stowed in his pouch. Shocked, he opened it and rummaged. They were indeed gone. "Paula, how the devil—" Paula laughed. "Did I get them? By using the same skills I've just taught you. But there's another little lesson for you. Now you know how to pick a pocket successfully, you must also learn to be on the guard against people with the same skill." Ezio looked gloomily at the broken blade which she'd returned to him with the bracer. "There's some kind of mechanism that goes with them. None of this is exactly in working condition," he said. "Ah," she said, "true, but I think you already know Messer Leonardo." "Da Vinci? Yes, I met him just before—" He broke off, forcing himself not to dwell on the painful memory. "But how can a painter be of any help to me with this?" "He's a lot more than just a painter. Take him to pieces. You'll see." Ezio, seeing the sense of what she was telling him, nodded his agreement, then said, "Before I go, may I ask you one last question?" "Of course." "Why have you given your aid so readily to me, a stranger?" Paula gave him a sad smile. By way of an answer, she drew up one of the sleeves of her robe, revealing a pale, delicate forearm, whose beauty was marred by the ugly, long, dark scars which crisscrossed it. Ezio looked and knew, at some time in her life, this lady had been tortured. "I, too, have known betrayal," Paula said. And Ezio recognized without hesitation that he had met a kindred spirit. 5. It was not far from Paola's luxurious house of pleasure to the busy back streets where Leonardo's workshop was, but Ezio did have to cross the spacious and busy Piazza del Duomo, and here he found his newly acquired skills of merging into the crowd especially useful. It was a good 10 days since the executions, and it was likely that Alberti would imagine that Ezio would have left Florence long since, but Ezio was taking no chances, and nor, by the look of the number of guards posted in and around the square, was Alberti. There would be plainclothes agents in place as well. Ezio kept his head well down, especially when passing between the cathedral and the baptistry, where the square was busiest. He passed by Giotto's Campanile, which had dominated the city for almost 150 years, and the great red mass of Brunelleschi's cathedral dome, completed only 15 years earlier, without seeing them, though he was aware of groups of French and Spanish tourists gazing up in unfeigned amazement and admiration, and a little burst of pride in his city tugged at his heart. But was it his city really any more? Suppressing any gloomy thoughts, he quickly made his way from the south side of the piazza to Leonardo's workshop. The master was at home, he was told, in the yard at the back. The studio was, if anything, in a greater state of chaos than ever, though there did seem to be some rough method in the madness. The artifacts Ezio had noticed on his earlier visit had been added to, and from the ceiling hung a strange contraption in wood, though it looked like a scaled-up skeleton of a bat. On one of the easels, a large parchment pinned to a board carried a massive and impossibly intricate knot design, and in a corner of it some indecipherable scribblings in Leonardo's hand. Agnolo had been joined by another assistant, Innocento, and the two were trying to impose some order on the studio, cataloguing the stuff in order to keep track of it. "He's in the backyard," Agnolo told Ezio. "Just go through. He won't mind." Ezio found Leonardo engaged in a curious activity. Everywhere in Florence you could buy caged songbirds. People hung them in their windows for pleasure, and when they died, simply replaced them. Leonardo was surrounded by a dozen such cages, and as Ezio watched, he selected one, opened the little wicker door, held the cage up, and watched as the linnet, in this case, found the entrance, pushed its way through, and flew free. Leonardo watched its departure keenly, and was turning to pick up another cage when he noticed Ezio standing there. He smiled winningly and warmly at the sight of him, and embraced him. Then his face grew grave. "Ezio, my friend, I hardly expected to see you here after what you've been through, but welcome, welcome. Just bear with me 1 minute. This won't take long." Ezio watched as he released one after another of the various thrushes, bullfinches, larks, and far more expensive nightingales into the air, watching each one very carefully. "What are you doing?" asked Ezio wonderingly. "All life is precious," Leonardo replied simply. "I cannot bear to see my fellow creatures imprisoned like this, just because they have fine voices." "Is that the only reason you released them?" Ezio suspected an ulterior motive. Ezio grinned, but gave no direct answer. "I won't eat meat any more either. Why should some poor animal die just because it tastes good to us? There'd be no work for farmers else. They could all grow corn. Imagine how boring that'd be. Anyway, there'd be a glut." "Ah, I was forgetting that you're a finanziatore, and I am forgetting my manners. What brings you here?" "I need a favor, Leonardo." "How can I be of service?" "There's something I inherited from my father that I'd like you to repair, if you can." Leonardo's eyes lit up. "Of course. Come this way. We'll use my inner chamber. Those boys are cluttering everything up in the studio as usual. I sometimes wonder why I bothered to employ them at all." Ezio smiled. He was beginning to see why, but at the same time sensed that Leonardo's first love was and would always be his work. "Come this way." Leonardo's smaller inner room was even more untidy than the studio, but among the masses of books and specimens and papers covered with that indecipherable scrawl, the artist, as always and incongruously impeccably dressed and scented, carefully piled some stuff on other stuff until a space was cleared at a large drafting table. "Forgive the confusion," he said, "but at last we have an oasis. Let's see what you've got for me, unless you'd like a glass of wine first." "No, no." "Good," said Leonardo eagerly. "Let's see it then." Ezio carefully extracted the blade, bracer, and mechanism, which he had previously wrapped in the mysterious vellum page that had accompanied them. Leonardo tried in vain to put the pieces of machinery back together, but failed, and seemed for a moment to despair. "I don't know, Ezio," he said. "This mechanism is old, very old, but it's very sophisticated as well, and its construction is ahead, I would say, even of our time. Fascinating." He looked up. "I've certainly never seen anything like it, but I'm afraid there's little I can do without the original plans." Then he turned his attention to the vellum page, which he had picked up in order to wrap Ezio's pieces back up again. "Wait a second!" he cried, poring over it. Then he placed the broken blade and bracer to one side, spread out the sheet, and referring to it, began to rummage among a row of old books and manuscripts on a nearby shelf. Finding the two he wanted, he placed them on the table and began carefully to leaf through them. "What are you doing?" asked Ezio, slightly impatiently. "This is very interesting," said Leonardo. "This looks very like a page from a codex." "A what?" "It's a page from an ancient book. This isn't printed, it's a manuscript. It's very old indeed. Have you any more of them?" "No." "Pity. People shouldn't tear the pages out of books like this." Leonardo paused. "Unless, perhaps, the whole thing together—" "What?" "Nothing. Look, the contents of this page are encrypted, but if my theory is correct, based on these sketches, it may very well be that—" Ezio waited, but Leonardo was lost in a world of his own. He took a seat and waited patiently while Leonardo rummaged through and pored over a number of books and scrolls, making cross-references and notes, all in that curious left-handed mirror writing he used. Ezio wasn't the only one, he supposed, to live his life with one eye looking behind him. From the little he'd seen of what was going on in the studio, if the church got wind of some of the things Leonardo was up to, he didn't doubt that his friend would be for the high jump. At last, Leonardo looked up, but by that time Ezio was beginning to doze. "Remarkable," muttered Leonardo to himself, and then, in a louder voice, "Remarkable! If we transpose the letters and then select every third—" He set to work, drawing the blade, bracer, and mechanism towards him. He dug out a toolbox from under the table, set up a vise, and quietly became absorbed in his work. An hour passed, 2. Ezio by now was sleeping peacefully, lulled by the warm fug of the room and the gentle sounds of tapping and scraping as Leonardo worked on. And at last— "Ezio, wake up!" "Eh?" "Look!" And Leonardo pointed to the tabletop. The dagger blade, fully restored, had been fitted into the strange mechanism, which in turn was fixed to the bracer. Everything was polished and looked as if it had just been made, but nothing shone. "A matte finish, I decided," said Leonardo, "like Roman armor. Anything which shines glints in the sun, and that's a dead giveaway." Ezio picked up the weapon and hefted it in his hands. It was light, but the strong blade was perfectly balanced on it. Ezio had never seen anything like it. A spring-loaded dagger that he could conceal above his wrist. All he had to do was flex his hand, and the blade would spring out, ready to slash or stab as its user desired. "I thought you were a man of peace," said Ezio, remembering the birds. "Ideas take precedence," said Leonardo with decision, "whatever they are. Now," he added, producing a hammer and chisel from his toolbox, "you're right-handed, aren't you? Good. Then kindly place your right ring finger in this block." "What are you doing?" "I'm sorry, but this is how it must be done. The blade is designed to ensure the total commitment of whoever wields it." "What do you mean?" "It'll only work if we have that finger off." Ezio blinked. His mind flashed on a number of images. He remembered Alberti's supposed friendliness to his father, how Alberti had later reassured him after his father's arrest, the executions, his own pursuit. He clamped his jaw. "Do it." "Maybe I should use a cleaver. Cleaner cut that way." Leonardo produced one from a drawer in the table. "Now, just place your finger così." Ezio steeled himself as Leonardo raised the cleaver. He closed his eyes as he heard it brought down, shunk, into the wood of the block. But he felt no pain. He opened his eyes. The cleaver was stuck in the block, inches from his hand, which was intact. "You bastard!" Ezio was shocked and furious at this tasteless practical joke. Leonardo raised his hands. "Calm yourself. It was just a bit of fun. Cruel, I admit, but I simply couldn't resist. I wanted to see how determined you were. You see, the use of this machine originally did require such a sacrifice, something to do with an ancient initiation ceremony, I think. But I've made 1 or 2 adjustments. So, you can keep your finger. Look, the blade comes out well clear of them, and I've added a hilt that flips out when the blade's extended. All you have to do is remember to keep them splayed as it's coming out, so you can keep your finger. But you might like to wear gloves when you use it. The blade is keen." Ezio was too fascinated and grateful to be angry for long. "This is extraordinary," he said, opening and closing the dagger several times until he could time its use perfectly. "Incredible." "Isn't it?" agreed Leonardo. "Are you sure you don't have any more pages like this one?" "I'm sorry." "Well, listen, if you do happen across any more, please bring them to me." "You have my word. And how much do I owe you for—" "A pleasure, most instructive. There is no—" They were interrupted by a hammering at the outer door of the studio. Leonardo hurried through to the front of the building as Agnolo and Innocento looked up fearfully. The person on the other side of the door had started to bellow. Open up, by order of the Florentine guard. Just a moment, Leonardo shouted back, but in a lower voice he said to Ezio, "Stay back there." Then he opened the door and stood in it, blocking the guardsman's way. "You Leonardo da Vinci?" asked the guard in one of those loud, bullying, official voices. "What can I do for you?" said Leonardo, moving out into the street, obliging the guard to step back. "I am empowered to ask you certain questions." Leonardo had by now so maneuvered himself that the guard had his back to the doorway of the studio. "What seems to be the trouble?" "We've had the report that you were seen just now consorting with a known enemy of the city." "What? Me? Consorting? Preposterous! When was the last time you either saw or spoke to Ezio Auditore?" "Who?" "Don't play silly buggers with me. We know you were close to the family, sold the mother a couple of your daubs. Maybe I need to refresh your memory a bit." And the guard hit Leonardo in the stomach with the butt of his halberd. With a sharp cry of pain, Leonardo doubled up and fell to the ground, where the guard kicked him. "Ready to chat now, are we? I don't like artists. Load of poofs." But this had given Ezio enough time to step quietly through the doorway and position himself behind the guard. The street was deserted. The nape of the man's sweaty neck was exposed. It was as good a time as any to give his new toy a trial run. He raised his hand, triggered the release mechanism, and the silent blade shot out. With a deft movement of his now open right hand, Ezio stabbed once into the side of the guard's neck. The recently honed edge of the blade was viciously sharp and eased through the man's jugular without the slightest resistance. The guard fell dead before he hit the ground. Ezio helped Leonardo up. "Thank you," said the shaken artist. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to kill him. There was no time." "Sometimes we don't have an alternative, but I should be used to this by now." "What do you mean?" "I was involved in the Saltarelli case." Ezio remembered then. A young artist's model, Jacopo Saltarelli, had been anonymously denounced a few weeks earlier for practicing prostitution, and Leonardo, along with 3 others, had been accused of patronizing him. The case had fallen apart for lack of evidence, but some of the mud had stuck. "But we don't prosecute homosexual men here," he said. "Why, I seem to remember that the Germans have a nickname for them. They call them Florence." "It's still officially against the law," said Leonardo dryly. "You can still get fined, and with men like Alberti in charge." "What about the body?" "Oh," said Leonardo, "it's quite a windfall. Help me drag it inside before anyone sees us. I'll put it with the others." "Windfall? Others?" "The cellar's quite cold. They keep for a week. I get 1 or 2 cadavers that no one else wants from the hospital now and then. All unofficial, of course. But I cut them open and dig about a bit. It helps me with my research." Ezio looked at his friend more than curiously. "What?" "I think I told you. I like to find out how things work." They dragged the body out of sight, and Leonardo's 2 assistants manhandled it through the door, down some stone steps, out of sight. "But what if they send someone after him to find out what happened to him?" Leonardo shrugged. "I'll deny all knowledge," he winked. "I'm not without powerful friends here, Ezio." Ezio was nonplussed. He said, "Well, you seem confident enough." "Just don't mention this incident to anyone else." "I won't. And thank you, Leonardo, for everything." "A pleasure. And don't forget," a hungry look had crept into his eyes, "if you find any more pages from this codex, bring them to me. Who knows what other new designs they might contain?" "I promise." Ezio made his way back to Paola's house in a triumphant mood, though he did not forget to lose himself in the anonymity of the crowd as he passed back north through the town. Paola greeted him with some relief. "You were gone longer than I'd expected." "Leonardo likes to talk. But that's not all he did, I hope." "Oh no, look." and he showed her the wrist dagger, extending it from his sleeve with an extravagant flourish and a boyish grin. Impressive. Yes, Ezio looked at it admiringly. I'll need a bit of practice with it. I want to keep all my own fingers. Paola looked serious. Well, Ezio, it looks as if you're all set. I've given you the skills you need. Leonardo has repaired your weapon. She took a breath. All that's needed now is for you to do the deed. Yes, said Ezio quietly, his expression darkening again. The question is, how best to gain access to Messer Alberti? Paola looked thoughtful. Duke Lorenzo is back with us. He isn't happy about the executions Alberti authorized in his absence, but he doesn't have the power to challenge the Gonfaloniere. Nevertheless, there's to be a vernissage for Maestro Verroccio's latest work at the cloister of Santa Croce tomorrow night. All Florentine society will be there, including Alberti. She looked at him. I think you should be too. Ezio found out that the piece of sculpture to be unveiled was a bronze statue of David, the biblical hero with whom Florence associated itself, poised as the city was between the twin Goliaths of Rome to the south and the land-hungry kings of France to the north. It had been commissioned by the Medici family and was destined to be installed in the Palazzo Vecchio. The maestro had started work on it 3 or 4 years earlier, and a rumor had been going round that the head was modelled on one of Verroccio's handsomer young apprentices of the time, a certain Leonardo da Vinci. At any rate, there was great excitement, and people were already dithering about what to wear for the occasion. Ezio had other matters to ponder. Watch over my mother and sister while I'm gone, he asked Paola, as if they were my own. And if anything should happen to me, have faith and it won't. Ezio made his way to Santa Croce in good time the following evening. He had spent the previous hours preparing himself and honing his skills with his new weapon until he was satisfied that he was truly proficient in its use. His thoughts dwelt on the deaths of his father and brothers, and the cruel tones of Alberti's voice as he passed sentence rang out too clearly in his mind. As he approached, he saw 2 figures whom he recognized walking ahead of him, slightly apart from a small squad of bodyguards whose uniform displayed a badge of 5 red balls on a yellow ground. They appeared to be arguing, and he hurried forward to bring himself within earshot of them. They paused in front of the portico of the church, and he hovered nearby, out of sight, to listen. The men addressed each other in tight-lipped tones. One was Uberto Alberti. The other, a slim young man in his mid to late 20s, with a prominent nose and a determined face, was richly dressed in a red cap and cloak over which he wore a silver-grey tunic. Duke Lorenzo, Il Magnifico, as his subjects called him, to the disgust of the Pazzi and their faction. You cannot tax me with this, Alberti was saying. I acted on information received and irrefutable evidence. I acted within the law and within the bounds of my office. No, you overstepped your bounds, Gonfaloniere, and you took advantage of my absence from Florence to do so. I am more than displeased. Who are you to speak of bounds? You have seized power over this city, made yourself duke of it without the formal consent of the Signoria or anyone else. I have done no such thing.